So I'm posting this video, this third installment of this of the third lecture series for this class. It seems impossible that it's the third one already. I'm posting this quite a bit later than I wanted to, but I did want to, for the sake of those who weren't in class last Tuesday, and even for those who were in class who would just like, either for their own notes or for their own edification and delight, for me to review the three articles. Well, one of them is a book chapter about Mrs. Dalloway, which we also discussed last Tuesday. And I want to discuss them because it seems to me that one of the goals by the end of this semester is that we will all be able to discuss works of literary criticism together. Discuss how they work, how they argue, whether or not we agree with them, what parts of the novels we are studying seem to be emphasized or privileged in the particular articles, how persuasive they are. These are rich conversations to have, and but just like reading poetry or reading fiction, if we're good structuralists, we know that we need some sort of immersion, enculturation, or training in the codes and conventions that we bring to bear on these articles. So that requires practice. That's the first thing I want to talk about. The second thing I want to say quickly, or the second sort of preface statement to me walking through these articles with you, is to say that it's kind of a waste of time to try to pigeonhole literary critics into the kinds of methodologies we'll be studying. Right? I said this actually in my first video, that there are, for instance, feminist scholars who are very good close readers, you know, the best of close readers, meaning there seems to be moments where they adopt a kind of new critical lens, but there's also feminist scholars who have, you know, psychoanalytic sympathies, or feminist scholars who are deconstructivist, or feminist scholars who are materialist or historical in their approach to their either the literature they study or the other cultural artifacts that they study, or the political stakes of their work. Okay, so that's just one example of the ways in which the kinds of methods we'll be studying overlap and interpenetrate each other. When it comes to new criticism and structuralism specifically, we're talking about two approaches to literature that can, you know, if only given one example of literary criticism, can be incredibly difficult to distinguish. And so it is somewhat pointless to try to argue about whether or not James Naremore is a new critic or a structuralist, because I'm not altogether convinced that he would position himself with either of those methodologies. Instead, what I think it's worthwhile to do is think about the arguments of these articles from within the position, the ideal position of the new critic, or the ideal position of the structuralist, right? And to think about the ways in which these articles, in a sense, all of them have new critical and structuralist tendencies, but we might also, by inhabiting those positions of a new critic or a structuralist, be able to see how a new critic or a structuralist would respond to the arguments and analyses of these articles. Okay, if that doesn't make sense, I'll try to model some of that for us here. So, in short, it's not really worth our time to try to pigeonhole specific literary critics within one and only one of the methodologies we'll be studying. But it is worthwhile, I think, to try to read works of literary criticism, if only for heuristic purposes, from a kind of idealized new critical position, or from an idealized structuralist position, just to kind of see how these mindsets conflict, but also how they might cooperate in giving an enlightened account of, or an enlightening account of a work of literature. And third thing I want to say, that's related to the other two, is just to recall from my first video that all the isms we'll be studying, new criticism, structuralism, deconstructionism, adding the ism there, feminism, queer studies, and so on, all these isms or fields are not monolithic methods or subjects. that they are instead a kind of loose association of concerns, concepts, problems, ideas, consequences, and limitations that we cluster together in order to help us make sense of how literary criticism has developed in the 20th century. Okay. Which is a kind of structuralist account of literary criticism in and of itself. So, and one we will be betraying throughout the semester. Okay. Okay, so the three articles you had to read for last Tuesday. The first was from 1944, pretty early, less than 20 years after Woolf publishes Mrs. Dalloway. It's an article that appeared in the journal College English, which I believe is still publishing articles. It was written by Natalia Wright. Okay. The second, which came, I believe, I think in 1965. I might be wrong about that. Check the description below. I'll have the correct date down there. It's by Anna S. Benjamin, or Benjamin, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name. The title of her article is Towards an Understanding of the Meaning of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Okay. You could probably guess just from that title that her article might verge more toward the new critical side of how to approach literature. The third text you had to read actually comes from James Naremore's, sorry about the glare, this is old decommissioned library book, so it still has the plastic cover on it. From James Naremore's book, The World Without a Self, Virginia Woolf and the Novel. The appearance in his subtitle of The Novel would suggest that he is attempting to read Virginia Woolf within the context of how, at least, British fiction was being written at her time, or in the decades leading up to her own writing career, or in the centuries leading up to her writing career, which would suggest a kind of structuralist or structuralist approach, because it's not so much a historical account, the subtitle suggests, but an account of how Woolf fits into a genre which has its own codes and conventions, and so he's going to be attempting to account for Woolf within that genre. Although we will see that the chapter on Mrs. Dalloway that we read does not itself look very structuralist at all, and I'll come back to that at the end here. So I want to begin by situating Wright's article. This is the 1944 article, Mrs. Dalloway, A Study in Composition, in this nexus between new criticism and structuralism, which is a bit odd, because in 1944, Wright's article would have been pre-structuralist. Ferdinand de Saussure, who I spoke about in an earlier video, was certainly alive and developing his linguistics at this time, but it had not yet migrated to the United States, and certainly had not been fully digested even by French thinkers like Roland Barthes, for instance, who early in his career was thought to be something of a structuralist thinker. Okay, so but despite the fact that this is technically a pre-structuralist article, it is, when you approach it, nevertheless interested in the relation between various themes, what it calls themes in Mrs. Dalloway. In other words, there is no one meaning or one theme that grounds and controls and harmonizes and balances the novel, but instead a kind of grid of intelligibility or perception that we need to give an account of if we're going to approach this book with any idea of what's going on at all. And so the sort of grid of perception, or the grid of intelligibility that Wright constructs in her reading of the novel, is somewhat structuralist, insofar as she's claiming that it isn't in attempting to balance out competing or contradictory ideas that one comes to a meaning, but rather in paying attention to the composition of the novel itself, or what she calls the composition. And so it might be worthwhile just to read the opening paragraphs of the article to get a sense of how this works. She writes, "An examination of Virginia Woolf's technique is the construction of Mrs. Dalloway." An examination of Virginia Woolf's technique in the construction of Mrs. Dalloway reveals a novel which is primarily neither a narrative nor a character sketch. In other words, it's not what we tend to presume a novel to be, right? It is a thematic study juxtaposing certain patterns for purely aesthetic ends. These patterns are not themes in the traditional sense. That is, none constitutes a text upon which a story like Vanity Fair or The Scarlet Letter may be told. Meaning that it's, what she means by theme is not like, love, which would produce a love story, right? But something else. They are, she says, writes, more properly elements of composition, bearing a structural relationship to one another and involving no plot at all. These elements of character, psychological states, sounds, and colors are not unique in Mrs. Woolf. The presence of each may be pointed to in all her novels, and indeed in many other novels of the present century. However, in Mrs. Dalloway, their recurrence as themes is most deliberate, and their ultimate synthesis one of her most brilliant achievements. Okay. In the second paragraph that I just read there, or those last few sentences that I read, it is pretty clear that what Wright is attempting to unfold here is a different way of reading fiction that doesn't rely on conventions or features like plot or character, conflict or tension, but instead is an attempt to map out a different system of codes and conventions that she suggests one could also bring to bear on novels that are contemporary to Mrs. Dalloway. In other words, novels written around the same time by different authors. So not just novels by Woolf, but novels by other authors. So this would very much be an attempt, although Wright is not, we might presume, is not influenced by Saussurian linguistics, is nevertheless, from a structuralist perspective that we could heuristically inhabit, we could see that even before structuralism becomes a concern in literary studies, that something that will look like structuralism will already have been in circulation, right? And why? Because in literary studies, structuralism becomes a foundation for rejuvenating a way of doing and reading art that is much older than structuralism, right? That's why Jonathan Culler, who we talked about last week and who I spoke about in a previous video, brings together the idea of structuralism and poetics. Poetics, of course, being a word that goes all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy, right? So anyway, just to give an idea that in literary studies, there is a kind of pre-structuralism already at work, and that's because the approach to literature that structuralism begins to ground in the 60s and 70s, in some sense was already in place, right? It just needed a theoretical formulation. Okay. And yet, that's all to try to say that Wright is kind of is not historically, but in her method of reading aligned with structuralism. Yet the concern here is still, in many ways, quite formalist, right? And what do I mean by this? Sorry, I'm flipping my pages here. If you flip to the end of her article, right, although she does go to great lengths to map out for us how the novel is structured, the way in which we might want to read it, and in some sense inventing a mode of approaching other works of fiction written around the same time, there is a concern, particularly with attempting to do this in order to give an account of a novel's unity, okay, which, if you recall, is a key word for new criticism, right? This is, page 357, okay? She has just gotten finished talking about what she calls the use of mechanical links, the ways in which the novel links up characters who know nothing about each other. What are the techniques that Woolf uses in order to move the narrative perspective from character to character, if these are characters who don't even talk to each other or know anything about one another? Okay. 357, second column, paragraph at the top. Far above these joints of the novel, however, a greater unity is achieved by the author's method of dealing with her elements of composition. Mrs. Woolf's style is not fluid, which, of course, Naremore will disagree with. One character does not merge into one another, or one theme or one moment into another. Her novel is distinctly put together of parts, but recurring and interrelated parts. Her style is contrapuntal, and the unity of the novel is not one of flow, but of rhythm. And so we get a quick account of the way in which the various frames she's been sketching out here operate in a kind of interplay with each other in order to bring about a unified and coherent interiority to this novel. And then look at the last paragraph on 358, a book which has this for a story, meaning not really much of a story at all, in which characters are ultimately reduced to shades of the spectrum and time to the striking of clocks. It is impertinent to abstract, right? As a reader, one has to read abstractly. Only the recurring themes of personality, of mental states, of colors and sounds may be charted. The composition is the thing. Okay. Wright, we could say, does not take the position, right, that plot, unity, or composition are external conventions which must be read into the text, but rather that they are, in some sense, there to be discovered, right? And so, in this sense, she would be more aligned with the idea of new criticism, which, at least in what we studied from Cleanth Brooks and what we studied in Parker's textbook, takes the position that meaning, even if it is a kind of coherence of contradictory attitudes and evaluations and interpretations, is nevertheless something to be uncovered and disclosed, and something that is alive within the text itself. Whereas for a structuralist, we only discover meaning because in some sense we've already been enculturated into systems of codes and conventions in which that text can be embedded, and which is thus sort of external to that text. Okay. All right. The next article we talked about, I may spend a little less time with this one, was Benjamin's Toward, not my article, but Anna Benjamin's Towards an Understanding of the Meaning of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. In some sense, this is the article that seems most aligned with a new critical project. And why? Because from the get-go, when you read the opening paragraph, Benjamin is all about attempting to seek out an account of how Woolf's techniques, especially techniques that seem rather obfuscating, are actually central, right? Not problematic, but central to understanding how Woolf's novel balances and harmonizes an idea of what Benjamin calls an organic view of reality. Okay. So, for instance, on the second page, right, 215, Benjamin argues, the method of presenting action and time as they are conceived in the organic universe is circular. Actually, spherical may be a better adjective, as opposed to the traditional linear development and representation of events in time. The circular method is used to present an organic world, because the traditional linear outline form which divides people and events into a single moment and a single place cannot convey the organic reality. To arrange the plot in linear form, as is traditional in novels or in narratives, places the emphasis wrongly upon action and physical events which are, in the organic world, only the superficial expression of a profounder reality. To avoid an emphasis unsuitable to the organic view of reality, the author, here Woolf, has woven the plot into a complicated structure, which reveals the action in bits and pieces throughout the entire novel. As constructed, the first page is not fully revealed until the last page, when the nexus of intertwined lives and places is completely rounded out. Right? This is, I mean, from the perspective of new criticism, I mean, exactly what a literary critic should be doing, right? Attempting to locate and articulate problematic things within the structure of the text that's being read, and to make some kind of defense. If the critic believes that, nevertheless, despite those problems, the text manages to balance and cohere into something that resolves the problems, the contradictions, and the conflicts inherent in there. So although readers unfamiliar with Woolf may come to the novel with a kind of unpreparedness for what they're about to encounter, right? This next, as Benjamin puts it, this nexus of intertwined lives and places that is just completely chaotic and confusing for a first-time reader. Nevertheless, there is something important about this presentation, this particular ordering, insofar as it gives a richer, more robust, and in some sense more faithful account of how life is lived, how reality operates, and how things are, in some sense, connected in non-linear ways, which is to say circular, or in this article, circular or spherical ways. Okay. This also, that's just one example of a moment in which Benjamin attempts to defend Woolf's choice here. On 217, I won't read the article. Benjamin also makes an argument about why the vagueness of exactly when the novel begins and ends is also key to this, to achieving this form of organic reality within the novel itself. Although it is so specific at times, we know exactly what time it is at times throughout the novel. And it's important that we do in order to make sense of what's happening in the present. Nevertheless, the bookends of the novel are in some sense vague. We don't quite know when it begins. We don't quite know exactly when the novel ends either. And of course, also one thing that this article also brings up is that in some sense the central conflict for Clarissa is in her own life, perhaps, her refusal of Peter Walsh, at least according to this article. 30 years earlier, or however many years before the events of the novel take place are. And so a traditional approach to telling this story would have actually put us in Burton, right? The novel would have opened when Clarissa Dalloway was 18 years old, and would have given us some account of perhaps the ruination of Peter Walsh after being refused, and of Clarissa's ascendancy, in some sense, in her marriage to Richard. And so a great deal of the novel would have been about those branching paths, and then near the end there would have been this climax of this reunion at this party, and the aftermath of that as well. But of course that's not the novel we're given. Right? We're given a much shorter novel, right, that has to compact all that stuff that a realist novel would have given us into something much more dense, right? And so Benjamin argues on page 220, the omission of the 30 dead years and their significance is the third and last feature to be examined here. Unless we can explain the significance of the 30 years that are virtually but not completely omitted from the novel, we must assume that Woolf contrived a literary tour de force, leaving 30 years unaccounted for, and so maneuvering the reader that he accepts the arbitrary omission without feeling any violation or verisimilitude. Mrs. Dalloway is a work of virtuosity, but the virtuosity in this case consists in the role that 30 unnarrated years play. The clue to the meaning lies in the coexistence and parallel characters, Clarissa and Septimus and their parallel birth and death. Septimus's actual birth coincides with Clarissa's rejection of Peter at Burton, 1893. Her rebirth, 30 years later, occurs on the same day as, and indeed is assisted by, the death of Septimus. We are told little of importance about the events in Clarissa's life after her marriage to Richard, when she ceased to live fully and instinctively, and when she lost the vitality that Peter had noticed and commented upon. Peter comments on her death after his strange dream in the park, and uses the phrase, the death of a soul. Clarissa herself felt her isolation and loneliness, even a sense of failure towards her husband. The 30 dead years were years in which Clarissa falsely set herself apart from the organic universe, and surrounded herself with the bulwarks society offered her. She functioned for 30 years for others, and she justified her existence by accepting society's reasons for living. As the novel opens, the 30 dead years are ending after an almost fatal illness, and the events of the day are carefully chronicled as they lead up to Clarissa's rebirth. She moves all day in the hovering shadow of death. She even wishes for it, but unlike Septimus, in a most controlled manner, as she goes through the tedious details of the life of an upper-class woman of Westminster, London, brought on her by her own decision to give a party. On the day of her rebirth, she finds her own reasons for life and becomes again Clarissa. Then the article quotes the last sentence of the novel, "For there she was." The shocks which led to her death and surrender to society are recounted. She saw the death of her sister Sylvia, an occasion that led her to her near atheism. She became disillusioned with Sally Seton. She could not reconcile herself to her rejection of Peter, which indeed she did not accept until the day of her rebirth. So I'm going to pause there. All I want you to notice is that, in some sense, we might see as a problem the fact that we as readers don't have access to those 30 years, to an account of what has happened. All we get are glimpses and flashbacks, bits and pieces, when characters living in the here and now are brought back to the past in only brief episodes. The argument of this article, though, is that that's precisely the point. Right? And that we can analyze how those 30 years, even if we don't have access to their content, we can still analyze how they inform the present moment. Right? And that is part, again, of the novel's organic view of reality. Okay. So, we might ask, though, how a structuralist would respond to this, right? Because this is, in some sense, an account of the uniqueness of Mrs. Dalloway, of the unity that is internal and inherent and immanent to this novel itself, right? Note that on the bottom of 215, in attempting to account for the ways in which Mrs. Dalloway deviates from the traditional structure of how novels and narratives unfold, that the article, nevertheless, alludes to the way in which Mrs. Dalloway seems much more like poetry. Or, at the bottom of the page, alludes to the way in which Mrs. Dalloway is set up almost like a lyrical drama. Or, as we turn the page, seems aligned with a method akin to the mature work of Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen. Right? So in class, someone asked, like, who's Ibsen, or what's lyrical drama, or, in what way is Mrs. Dalloway like poetry? Like, those are things we can pursue if we want. But what a structuralist would respond to Benjamin by saying, look, right, I mean, what you're picking out of the novel, you're only seeing because you're bringing, again, codes and conventions to bear on the novel, right? They may not be the codes and conventions of a traditional novel or a traditional narrative, but they are nevertheless codes and conventions of poetry, of lyrical drama, of your own experience reading Henrik Ibsen, that you're drawing on in order to give an account and to produce the meaning within Mrs. Dalloway. What is it, a structuralist would say to the author of this article, that has enabled you to make this meaning of the novel, because it isn't necessarily only something internal to the novel itself. Okay. And then they would point to those moments as evidence of that. Okay. Alrighty, so, sorry about that. Turn the page. All right, so those are two of our articles. The last one I want to look at really would require its own video. James Naremore's book, The World Without a Self, Virginia Woolf and the Novel. This was written in 1973. It's hard to believe the price tag on mine is $8.75 for a hardcover book published by Yale University Press. That's not going to happen these days, okay? But what I do want to point out, I'll quickly just kind of go through some of this and read, maybe just read a few things. I see the video's already getting to be half an hour, so I want to try to wrap this up as quickly as I can. Let's read the first paragraph that runs from 77 to 78, and then I just want to say a few things about how Naremore is positioning himself and positioning the argument of his chapter before moving on to show the ways in which this is, in some sense, a new critical response to the limitations of a structuralist approach to literature. Okay, does that make sense? A new critical response to a structuralist approach to accounting for Mrs. Dalloway. So, Naremore argues, the opening of Mrs. Dalloway is a good example of what Robert Humphrey calls indirect interior monologue. That would be indirect interior monologue is when you have a third-person narrator who seems nevertheless to draw so close to the consciousness of its characters that it begins to take on the diction, the attitude, the position of that character. So it's this odd blurring of first-person and third-person narration. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Excuse me. Naremore continues, the method has a reasonably high degree of verisimilitude, at least in that Mrs. Dalloway's thoughts seem to follow one another by free association. She is preparing for a rather large party, since her servant Lucy has many things to do, and since it is an unusually fine summer's day. Clarissa has decided to buy the necessary flowers herself. Note how Naremore is almost paraphrasing what's going on in the opening pages, right? She thinks about the work planned for the day and the beauty of the morning. The freshness of the air and the squeak of a hinge on the door lead to a Proustian evocation of her youth at Burton, and this makes her, excuse me, remember Peter Walsh, whom she characterizes by his eyes and his smile, his pocket knife, and his epigrams. Skip the parenthetical. The method also gives the impression that the controlling author has tried to efface her personality. When the author's voice separates itself from the mental life of Clarissa Dalloway, it offers only rather prosaic rhetorical asides, as in the following lines, where I have italicized the relevant phrases. And then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning. For so it has always seemed to her, when, with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, how fresh, how calm the air was for a girl of 18, as then she was. End quote. Naremore continues, it seems that the author wants to avoid confusion, as much as possible by providing the necessary signposts for the scene. She wants to make clear that Clarissa Dalloway's thoughts are the subject, to offer a suggestion of the exterior surroundings, a lady with a servant girl, the lady stepping out of her door on a fresh morning, and to distinguish reverie from the here and now, past and present. The technique is economical and unobtrusive. Indeed, once the reader has established for himself the perspective of the first pages, he reads on almost without noticing the author's brief guides. Even so, the method creates a certain ambiguity. Thought Clarissa Dalloway clearly is spoken by the author alone. Naremore has this weird thing about conflating the narrator and the author in this chapter, so that's sort of what he means here, the narrator. Thought Clarissa Dalloway, in quotes, clearly is spoken by the author or the narrator alone, but what about the other phrases I have underlined? Are they simply statements by the author, or are they too a part of Clarissa's thoughts, a reflection of her self-consciousness? So, what's important here, what Naremore is setting up in this opening paragraph, is the way in which the structuralist concept, right, indirect interior monologue, a concept or a code or a convention of narrativizing, of storytelling, that if we're enculturated into how to recognize it, will help us read modernist fiction like Mrs. Dalloway, like James Joyce's Ulysses. Naremore is saying, look, the opening page of this novel is a good example of the way in which this convention or this code operates. And yet, right, and yet, very slyly, even so, the method also creates a certain ambiguity. Right, and so here we see a little crack that Naremore has said, look, Mrs. Dalloway fits nicely with this structuralist category, indirect interior monologue, but then begins to say, but maybe it doesn't fit it quite all that well. Or actually there's all this other stuff going on that category does not help us account for. And so we need, in some sense, to push that category aside, right, and actually spend time reading this novel closely, right? In other words, that's how far structuralism has got us, indirect interior monologue. Now let's see what else this narrative perspective is doing in this novel, okay? So that's what I mean by saying that Naremore, the whole chapter is in some sense a new critical response to that structuralist approach of assigning categories to things like perspective or things like setting. And you'll see a lot of that going on in the reading you're doing for this week in Chapman, in the chapter from Chapman's book. You'll see that that's exactly his approach to literature, because what he's attempting to do is to produce a poetics, right? A theory of how stories are put together, okay? The codes and conventions that we're enculturated in when we grow up, when we go to school, and when we read fiction. Okay. So we're getting close to 40 minutes now, so I just want to point out a few more things. Okay. So on page, I'll just note some things. So on page 80, for instance, Naremore shows how the hypnotic style of Woolf's fiction seems to evade the perspective that's being set up. And so that's a new problem that needs to be accounted for. How does Woolf create this hypnotic style, and why, right? In what way does indirect interior monologue as a structuralist category fail to account for what that seems to be doing? He focuses a lot on Woolf's proclivity for pattern formation, right? These long stretches that are nothing but the kind of like descriptive summary of what characters are looking at, right? For what reason do we do this, and to whom do we assign this perception? Is it the narrator who's looking at the world and composing these things together, or is it the character to whom the narrator is close that is doing that? So look on page 81 for that, but also 101 to 102. Okay. But, and speaking of 102, if we turn there right now, it's this far into the novel that Naremore shifts away from simply demonstrating how the narrative perspective does more than that category indirect interior monologue is able to account for, and actually connects up the way in which the perspective works with one of the primary thematic problems at work in the novel. Okay. So on page 102, he writes, "But it remains to be seen what particular vision of life determined this style." Right. Meaning what idea about living or of reality was the inspiration for the style of storytelling that he's just been going over with us for several pages. The primary motive behind Mrs. Dalloway, I hope to show, is the same one already detected in The Voyage Out. So we had a chapter on Woolf's first novel earlier in his own book. Clarissa Dalloway, like so many of Virginia Woolf's characters, is beset by the problem of aloneness and separateness in life. Quote, the supreme mystery which Kilman might say she had solved, or Peter might say he had solved, but Clarissa didn't believe either of them. Didn't believe either of them had the ghost of an idea of solving, was simply this. Here was one room, there was another. Did religion solve that? Or love? This, in fact, is the central problem that Mrs. Woolf tries to deal with in all her fiction. We'll talk about that for Mrs. Woolf thing that showed up in 2 of our articles later in the semester. It is intimately related, of course, to the problem of death, the ultimate separation from one point of view, the ultimate confirmation of the separateness of things. Okay, so here he begins to develop an argument about how the workings of the perspective itself, the point of view, how the narrator works, and how the narrator seems to draw close to consciousness, how it seems to back up, how at times it seems to be attempting to actually compose a reality for us. At other times it's operating in an ironic way, a way that the other articles didn't seem to pick up on, right? And in other words, the narrator seems to do whatever on earth it wants to do, right, in this novel. And Naremore suggests that the reason for why it does that is linked up with the novel's primary conflict and inspiration. And that is the problem of how to deal with aloneness and separation. This I sort of covered in an earlier video, but also how we might experience the oneness of reality, or the unity of reality, which is the other side of that coin. Right? And the way in which we get around to that is by showing that in order to experience that oneness, in order to get outside and do more than scratch at the walls of our cell, right, which is a phrase that comes from Sally and Peter's conversation near the end of the novel, one has to enter into and go through a kind of self-annihilation, or a kind of, let's call it death. Okay. And so I am way too long right now, so I'm just going to read the last paragraph of his chapter, and then move on from there. Okay. And in fact end after a quick summary. Naremore, this is on page 110. In fact, however, were Mrs. Dalloway to experience such intense emotion for long, the emotion she's experiencing at her party when she withdraws to think about the death of this stranger, Septimus Smith, she would have to die just as Septimus does, or at least sacrifice her social identity. Instead, she seems to absorb Septimus's experience, and as a result, she comes to terms with death. The novel, like so much of Virginia Woolf's fiction, is elegiac. Mrs. Dalloway, aging and in poor health, no longer fears death, but embraces it. Let's skip to the last page, 111. And direct contact with others, actually bottom of 110. In either case, the natural abode for the soul seems to be somewhere down under the lovely water. And direct contact with others after one has been submerged so long is a harsh and abrasive experience. Such a process no doubt accounts for one of the effects we encounter fairly often in Mrs. Woolf's fiction, a smooth liquid stream of sensibility, abruptly interrupted by the violent contact of life outside in the form of a sound, like a backfire or a doorbell. In a larger sense, this watery world, where identity is muted, and the self seems to blend with the outside, where in solitude the individual feels at peace and harmony with an elemental form of life. This world is Virginia Woolf's style. Okay. And so in that last sentence, Naremore encapsulates, right, the fact that Woolf's style is not so easily accounted for by these structuralist categories, but rather that what it is doing is unique to her oeuvre, to her life, to her concerns. Right? And it's only in a careful, close reading of the novel that we're able to connect up those things. Right? That her experimental style, her experimental form, her unique project in Mrs. Dalloway is tied up with these other concerns, right? These ideas, these visions of life. And that in some sense, that account of the style, how it works, is the vision of life that Woolf is attempting to unfold. Right? This should remind us of Cleanth Brooks, that it's in close attention to the particular text that we become alive, right, to the vitality of the text itself, okay, and to the unified meaning it's attempting to balance and harmonize and resolve by juxtaposing and putting into relationship competing and conflicting attitudes and meanings. Okay. When we get to deconstruction, what we'll see is also a very close attention to textual detail, but the attitude toward what one finds in texts is much, much different. Okay? Although, like Naremore, it too will challenge structuralist concerns. Okay. All right, well, that went way too long, partly because each article probably requires a bit more conversation than I gave them here. But I hope that helped a little bit in trying to situate these arguments in, the word nexus has come up again and again, in the nexus between these ideal positions of the new critic and the structuralist. And tomorrow we'll be adding the deconstructivist to that pairing and really try to struggle with how to distinguish those three positions, but also what those three positions might share in common. Okay? All right. Okay. As always, if you have questions, let me know. If you're watching this video after class, I hope you aren't too confused, but I think it'll still be worthwhile to review for yourself what was happening in these articles, especially as we're moving quickly through all these isms, as it were. Okay. See you soon.